it is that he has. But I think everybody would also expect Prince Charles to be who he is.
To be who he is. Now, he's expressed views on lots of things, but by far the most important area, and the area where he probably has broadest support in the population, is on the environment and global warming. Do you think it's going to be good for us to have a head of state who has been so clear about the dangers of environmental damage and the dangers of the way the world is right now?
Goodness gracious, yes. And to have the monarch that understands his issues, and let's be blunt, he's been ahead of his time. He was ahead of most of the rest of us, and by goodness he gets this. And to have someone that can represent our interests when we're talking about meeting heads of states elsewhere, and I think championing what
in 300 yards, slide right onto Causeway A312.
We've got to get to net zero. I think to have a king that's expressed himself the way he has, I think it's beneficial and helpful for all of us that he's been able to do that.
That was Ian Blackford, the SNP leader in Westminster. Now, earlier...
Take the next right onto Causeway A312.
On that theme, in the last few hours, there was a surreal event that happened in Parliament Square involving Paul Polsland, who is a barrister and climate activist, and what appears to be at least an overzealous police officer. I'm glad to say that Paul joins me now. Paul, let's...
Continue on A312 for 1 mile.
In Parliament Square, and what do you do?
So, following on from the scenes of people holding up banners saying, or just signs saying, not my king, I decided to go one further and just put up nothing at all, because I was worried that if I wrote not my king, I'd be manhandled like the woman on the video that we saw in Parliament Square earlier.
So you arrived with a blank piece of paper?
Yeah,
is that right?
And then people asked what I was doing. I said, well, actually making a bit of a protest about the right to free speech, and that actually it's very chilling that people can't even just stand peacefully and silently with messages that are, completely respectful, but and I asked a number of police officers whether if I wrote not my king on it, that they would then arrest me, and they weren't able to answer. I walked around a bit, went down to Downing Street, and then an officer approached and said, effectively, can I have your details? I said, why? I'm just holding a blank piece of paper.
You're nicked, my son.
He didn't, to be fair to him, he didn't say that with a blank piece of paper. I think he realised that would be even too silly for the current things of what's going on. But he did say that if I did write not my king on it, that he would be likely to arrest me under the Public Order Act, which is obviously ludicrous. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was going to ask, to what extent, you're a barrister, do you think the new Public Order Act has changed the law in a way that makes these protests harder? Because we have had a long tradition in this country. We're able to say what we think, we're able to express what we think. We're not able to cause public disorder, in other words, have punch-ups in the street or anything like that, but we are able to say what we think. Has this act changed relations between the police and protesters, do you think?
Well, it seems to have. There seem to be more and more instances of overzealous policing. I didn't actually know today, because he said Public Order Act, whether he means the Public Order Act 1986, which is the old one, or the new one.
The new one.
Yeah, there has been a long history of police interpreting Section 5 of the Public Order Act to basically say if anyone might find something vaguely offensive, they'll arrest you for it. That's not entirely in tradition.
I suppose, I'm sorry to jump in there, I suppose the thinking on the police side is that if you say not my king, don't want Charles III, yah boo, whatever, then there will be monarchists around who might have a go at you, and then there is a public order problem. I suppose that is the logic behind it, if there is a logic behind it, which I doubt. I'm trying here.
We don't know, do we? I mean, that might be the logic, or it might be an attempt by the police to help enforce a narrative when no one's allowed to question Charles' accession to the throne. And that might be it as well, for all we know. Because frankly, if monarchists started having a debate with me, I'd love that. I love having a debate with people on the street. It's one of my favourite activities as an English person, is to debate people on the street. But if they started threatening violence, then it's the job of the police to stop them from being violent towards me, not to try and
stop you from saying what you want.
Exactly.
Well, an extraordinary little episode on an extraordinary day. Paul, for now, thank you very much indeed. Let me turn to Rachel, because Rachel, I would say clearly the police were overreacting. Clearly that's an absurd situation where someone's got a completely blank piece of paper and is warned about walking around with a blank piece of paper. But you can begin to understand why the police might be jumpy at the moment, given the extraordinary number of people who are going to be pouring into London and the apparent relative lack of preparations about how to deal with them.
Well, the police have an absolutely enormous job on their hands, and this is something you have to remember. They will have been planning for this for years, for decades, preparing for the moment of the Queen's death and for the hundreds of thousands to millions of people who will be flocking to London. But just take on Wednesday, for example, lying in state will begin at Westminster Hall. That's when the Queen's coffin will be displayed in Westminster Hall, and people can flock to it, can walk past it somberly. We're expecting something like 750,000 people to come to London over the space of 4 or 5 days.
And people have been saying, I think not entirely jokingly, that we're going to run out of pavements, run out of tarmac, run out of hotel beds, run out of everything in London because of the sheer pressure of people.
Central London is going to feel very full, and there will be people queuing to see the Queen's coffin for, it's thought, possibly up to 24 hours, a queue that could stretch up to 5 miles. If you go out of the studio here, I walked earlier to here from Buckingham Palace, the amount of bollards out, the amount of police, we're expecting some 10,000 officers on the street every day.
In 200 yards, at Wagoners Roundabout, take the second exit onto the Parkway A312.
Operation, both from the fact that you've got lots of people, there's the risk of protesters, and also you have, towards the end of the week, dignitaries. You're going to have presidents and prime ministers and other kings and queens from all over the world coming to this city.
And I read, I don't know if you can confirm this, that they're not allowed to come in their own private jets. They have to use commercial jets, ordinary planes, to come in, and when they hear they can't have their great big cavalcades, they have to go on buses.
It seems that way, yes.
President Biden on a bus.
A story in Politico over the weekend that suggested because there's so many dignitaries coming, they are going to have to be bussed in from West London. They're not allowed their private jets and helicopters, and I think they're going to find the whole thing rather difficult. But it's all for the Queen. It's all for that funeral on Monday.
Rachel, as ever, fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Earlier in the show, we were talking about the Scots and the monarchy, but of course the new king was Prince of Wales, as is his son, William, now. So what is the feeling there? Mark Drakeford is leader of the Welsh Assembly, and he joins me now. Mark Drakeford, welcome. First of all, can I ask you, we all remember, of course, that the former Prince of Wales, now King Charles, made strenuous efforts to learn Welsh before his investiture. Are you expecting Prince William to do the same?
Well, I don't think it could be a Prince of Wales.
Exit the roundabout onto the Parkway. Continue on the Parkway for 1 mile.
People every single day in every part of Wales. So I'm not expecting anybody to become fluent overnight in the language.
It's not the easiest language, Mark, is it? It's not the easiest for an outsider.
I've never really thought that thing. It's a language like any other. Some of the pronunciation can be a challenge if you're not brought up in the rhythms of the language and so on. But you can learn Welsh just as you can learn French or German or Italian. And I would expect an incoming Prince of Wales to take an interest in the language and a respectful interest in it without expecting miracles of fluency overnight.
Well, I have friends learning Welsh, so I know you're right. Ask about the other thing that we associate with the the previous Prince of Wales, if I can put it that way, now the King, that extraordinary, very, very grand, almost Ruritanian, if I can put it that way, investiture at Carnarvon Castle in 1969. Are we going to see anything remotely like that for Prince William?
Well, Wales of 2022 is quite definitely not the Wales of 1969, and I think it will be a misleading model to look to see what would be sensible and proportionate in a modern Wales. My own view is that there is no rush about these things. There is time for new Prince of Wales to get a feel for the responsibilities he's taken on, to find a way of making the job his own. His father did.
In a quarter of a mile, at Cranford Parkway interchange, take the second exit onto the M4 slip road to Heathrow Airport, M25.
He had a home in Wales, Nis Mon, when he was a helicopter pilot, I think, so he knows Wales. But can I ask you more broadly about the argument or the discussion going on in Wales about whether you actually need a Prince of Wales anymore?
Well, that discussion certainly is being had, and it's a perfectly proper debate. Myself, I don't think debate to engage in this week. There are other things that people are more preoccupied
of course
with. There will be time for people to debate the merits of that argument, and I'm sure it will be done in a perfectly civilized way in which people with very different views will be able to debate the merits. However, it will be against the background of the fact that the decision is made. We have a principal house, and in many ways, our energies are probably better directed into seeing how we can best use that new opportunity.
That said, then, Mark, what would you like to see from the new Prince of Wales? What can he bring to Wales? How can he help?
Exit the roundabout onto the slip road.
He's spent time living.
In a quarter of a mile, merge onto M4.
I had an opportunity to speak with him yesterday, and he was very warm in remembering the time he spent on Ynys Môn, the importance of that period in his life. I think he feels a particular attachment to the north of Wales. But what I think he will want to do is he will want to get a sense of modern Wales, the things that matter to Wales today, the possibilities that we have for the future. And in many ways, the things that are important about Wales chime in with the things that have already been.
Yes.
Continue on M4 for 3 miles.
Capacity for renewable energy, our determination to tackle the climate and nature emergency. I think he will find many things in contemporary Wales that will resonate with him and where he will be able to make a contribution.
Mark Drayford, I'm hugely grateful to you for joining us tonight. It's been fascinating listening to you. Thank you very much indeed. And you are, all of you, listening to Andrew Marr on LBC. Coming up, we're going to be hearing from John Bolton, who's the former National Security Advisor under Donald Trump, and he'll be giving us his perspective on the Ukrainian counteroffensive over the weekend. But first, it's 6:31 and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
The Queen's coffin is lying at rest at St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. The casket, draped with the royal standard, has been moved from the Palace of Holyrood House. A service of thanksgiving for Her Majesty has also been held. Domestic chaplain to the Queen, Reverend Kenneth Mackenzie, says the Queen often expressed her love for Scotland.
She went around, she met people, she was always gracious to people that she just happened to bump into who were enjoying the countryside just as she was. She loved the fact that they were enjoying what she was enjoying.
People in Scotland will be able to pay their respects over the next 24 hours before the coffin is flown to London. Hundreds of thousands of people are expected to turn out to see Her Majesty in Westminster Hall. Some people have already started queuing at 48 hours before lines open. King Charles has received a motion of condolence tabled in Holyrood by First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. The SNP leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford, has told Tonight with Andrew Marr he holds His Majesty in high esteem.
He's a tremendously engaging character. He's always happy to talk with you and talk about a wide range of subjects. And I can reflect on the meeting that we had on Saturday, and we were there for an awful lot longer than we were supposed to be, and that's the measure of the man. He's fantastically engaging.
Earlier, the King addressed Parliament as monarch for the first time, thanking MPs and peers for their condolences. Number 10 has announced a minute's silence the night before the Queen's funeral on Monday, the 19th of September. Also this evening, police are searching part of a golf course in Liverpool for a weapon following the death of Olivia Pratt-Corbell.
In half a mile, keep right to stay on M4.
In Liverpool. LBC weather, patchy rain across England and Wales tonight. A few showers in northern Scotland, a low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC Tonight with Andrew Marr.
It's 6:33. Now, earlier in the show, I read you some of that absolute...
Keep right to stay on M4.
...by President Zelensky, made soon after the Ukrainian army had punched through Russian defences near the northern border, inflicting a humiliating defeat on Putin's army. This is not victory, but could it be a turning point? And if the Russian president is now cornered, how might he lash out? Ambassador John Bolton was National Security Advisor to President Trump, and I'm delighted to say he joins me now. Ambassador Bolton, I want to talk to you, of course, about those extraordinary events in Ukraine. But before I do, given the day that we're having here in Britain, I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on the late Queen Elizabeth II. You've written a piece, very interesting, because you're a Republican as well as an American, and I assume the clue is in the name, arguing that there are advantages in a more monarchical system, even from the point of view of someone who has a presidential one.
Well,
Well, I think if you look at the evolution of Britain's constitutional system, the gradual separation of the function of head of state from head of government, which is now held by the Prime Minister, gives a national figure an embodiment of the entire country that people can look up to, that can provide a steadying effect, a legitimizing effect on national affairs, especially in time of war or great crisis. When you combine the two functions as we do, and by the way, we copied George III, who was both head of state and head of government. You just evolved in a different direction. That's not possible because, especially in these days, everybody sees the president as head of his party, head of government, not so much as head of state. So Queen Elizabeth was able to, in her constitutional station, provide a measure of legitimacy and stability that presidents really can. I think this is important for people in the U.S. to understand, but maybe important for people in Britain too. This is not a matter of sentiment about the Queen or the King. It's a constitutional function we're talking about.
In a quarter of a mile, keep right to stay on M4.
If there was an American monarch, do you think your country might be slightly less divided culturally and in other ways?
Well, it's hard. It's a counterfactual question since we don't know. I mean, we are in a period of high partisanship, but there have been similar periods in the past. I think there's a tendency to look at the president.
Keep right to stay on M4.
Before we did have a civil war in 1860, 1865, things can get worse. I'm not saying we're headed in that direction. It's difficult.
Continue on M4 for 4 miles.
But, we have recovered from something like this before.
Well, of course, we had a civil war as well. Let me ask you about these extraordinary events. A little while ago, yes. These extraordinary events unfolding in Ukraine. Give us your assessment of what's going on.
Well, just when you think you can't see any worse performance by the Russian military, they give it to you. We have only incomplete reports, but they were not only caught apparently totally by surprise by the Ukrainian offensive, but chain of command of the Russian military collapsed. Soldiers were fleeing, abandoning tanks and other equipment, really running in the face of the Ukrainian attack. And that has to be enormously damaging to the morale and stability of the Russian military across the board. To see this kind of defeat inflicted on them, we really can't calculate how bad it's going to be. I think, ironically, it makes it longer, makes it likely the war will grind on longer, because there's no chance now, in my view, that Putin would be prepared to say we've accomplished our objectives, we're declaring the ceasefire, that he would use to split Europe with winter coming on. He would seize on the view of some countries that they wanted the war to go away. I think he cannot do that in the face of these substantial territorial and personnel losses. So I think he's in a much more difficult position now than he was 48 hours ago.
And potentially a more dangerous one for the rest of us, I suppose. Do you take seriously these beginning slight signs of dissent inside Russia? I know that councillors in one district in St. Petersburg have written to the Duma, petitioned the Duma to remove President Putin because of the war in Ukraine, and are accusing him of treason. Now, whether this is just a tiny group of very brave people who are going to be squashed, whether there is something bigger going on in Russia, is quite hard to discern. But again, given your experience, I'm interested in your view.
Well, I think Putin's political position at home now is more in peril than at any point since this war began on February the 24th. I think we in the West have generally made a mistake by calling it Putin's war to try and personalize it. There are many, many Russians who believe that the breakup with the Soviet Union was illegitimate, that Ukraine is an illegitimate state. They want it back, not for the Soviet Union.
In 2 miles, at junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
Of getting Ukraine back. I don't think he can hide this kind of defeat. I think this is very difficult to obscure with propaganda. So I do foresee here real political liability that didn't exist before the Ukrainian offensive.
And of course, we have to remember, I suppose, that if we think Putin's bad, there's much worse there as well in Russia in terms of extreme nationalist propagandists and politicians.
Yeah, look, you could have a coup inside Russia, in theory anyway, that removed Putin but put in somebody who was worse. This government itself is the problem, and until we return to the 1990s when it looked like Russia might be emerging into a democratic society. It's just going to be one authoritarian government after another, and we shouldn't have any illusions about that.
Ambassador Bolton, I said earlier on that, of course, if he's cornered, the Putin regime could be more dangerous still. What are the things we should be worried about or looking for if he decides to lash out, if he decides to change the game in some way?
Well, the ultimate question that's been posed a number of times over the past 6 months is, would he use nuclear weapons? And my view has been that it was extremely unlikely, and the only circumstances I could foresee where he would use battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons were if Russian troops were in wholesale retreat heading back to the borders of Russia. And we're not at that point after this most recent Ukraine offensive, but it's been a military catastrophe for the Russian army. And I do think to try and reestablish...
In a quarter of a mile at Junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
More likely now of a possible nuclear use. You can see it in part. They've attacked the electrical grid at Kharkiv in retaliation, harming civilians, not military personnel. But something like that, I think, could be on Putin's mind.
Exit at Junction 6.
Very interesting that the European price of gas falling for the first time, falling quite sharply at the moment, back down to the level it was at in
a quarter of a mile at the roundabout, take the third exit onto Tons Lane, A355.
Squeeze the West, and in particular the European democracies, by using the gas price is failing.
Well, it's a possibility. It could be the price of gas, like the price of oil in the United States, is falling because people think we're about to head into a recession, and therefore there'd be less industrial use. And I do think that's something to worry about, as the Fed and other monetary authorities in the West look to try and squeeze inflation down. The restraint put on the economy could take us into recession, and that especially applies to energy prices.
Mr. Bolton, you were National Security Advisor under Donald Trump, of course, and you've written about that yourself. I must ask you about the Mar-a-Lago saga going on. What do you think may be in these papers that's so damaging and so toxic, if you like, that the President wanted to keep them close?
Exit the roundabout onto Tons Lane.
Politics of what's happening now.
Well, I will say this, of course, none of us have seen the documents, so it's easy to have an opinion about them, and frankly, there are a lot of opinions out there on both sides that aren't even partially informed. But I would say this politically.
In a quarter of a mile, turn left towards Sippenham Lane.
Going after Trump here and doesn't have something really significant, it's a political gift to Trump. You know, to paraphrase Machiavelli, and he was speaking... literally, I'm just speaking metaphorically in the political sense. Machiavelli said, in effect, you must either caress a prince or kill him. So the president's not an ordinary citizen. If you're going to go after him, it's not just for a traffic ticket. It's because there's a very, very serious breach here of classification. If they don't have that or they can't prove it, Trump benefits because he can say, see, I'm being persecuted again.
Yeah.
Turn left towards Sippenham Lane.
Classified document, so we know there is the potential for something quite serious there, and there have been suggestions there's sort of compromat on the French president.
Continue for 1.5 miles.
If it goes wrong, this puts Trump back into the White House next time, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not sure it's that bad. I think it may be worse for the Republican Party. My own view is before the Mar-a-Lago search warrant, I didn't think Trump would run for the nomination. I think he doesn't want to be called a loser in history. He would fear losing again. I think he would talk about running incessantly until the last moment and then try and be a kingmaker for the Republican nomination. This search warrant affair may be enough to induce him into the race. I very much fear, based on the polling my own super PAC has done and others, that independents would go to the Democrat in overwhelming numbers, and he would lose again in 2024 and take down a lot of Republican candidates with him.
That's a fascinating analysis. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Bolton. Thank you, Ambassador Bolton, for joining us. Much appreciated. Now, how does it feel on the ground in Ukraine? We've been talking about the grand picture, but Kira Rudiks, a Ukrainian MP and leader of the Golos political party, she joins us now from Ukraine, though for security reasons we can't, of course, say exactly where. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Can I first of all ask you about the atmosphere in Ukraine at the moment? Because this has clearly been a stunning victory for Ukrainian forces. President Zelensky's speech was an absolute belter. How